Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the podcast today, we have Phil Elmore. Phil, welcome.
Thank you.
Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, I am a professional writer. I'm actually many times over a writer. My life is a series of desks, and I move from desk to desk, writing different things at different desks. I've written extensively in the fiction world. I've written dozens of commercially published novels. I also write nonfiction. I'm a technical writer. And most recently, I've become a writing coach, not only helping individuals to reach what I would call their authoring goals, where they become authors, but also to help businesses take advantage of the marketing opportunity that is having a nonfiction book, or sometimes even a fiction book, that's a tie-in property that they can use to accomplish their goals. One of the things I find myself doing is explaining to many business owners, small business owners, large businesses alike, how that can benefit them, and then how they can also accomplish that goal through a coaching company like mine without adding a lot of extra time and effort to what they're doing. Because obviously, the last thing a business owner wants you to do is roll up onto their doorstep and say, let me show you how to spend a lot of your time doing something you don't want to do.
Well, thank you for that. On one of my episodes, I did actually say, this is near enough a quote. I said, you are a person who I've spoken to who has got the most books. And I think this person wrote 8 books. Now, the next question for you, as you can imagine, how many books have you written, Phil?
That is a tough question to answer because I have ghostwritten so many books that I'm not allowed to take credit for that I stopped counting. I know that I wrote 23 books in the Executioner series for an imprint of Harlequin, a romance novel company. They used to have a men's adventure imprint. And for many, many years, teams of ghostwriters like me wrote entries in what was a very long-running action series. The series actually it inspired The Punisher, for example. They're all series about lone gunmen who make the very rational, logical decision to shoot everyone who is vaguely related to the people that killed their families. Oh, the mob figured indirectly in the death of my family. I guess I'll kill all of the mob then, which is pretty much the first 40 books of the Executioner series. There are hundreds of books in that series. When the original authors sold the rights to the imprint that belongs to Harlequin, they employed many, many writers. I've met lots of other fellow Executioner writers who helped turn out those hundreds of books in crossover series and spin-off series and in the main series. I've written all kinds of nonfiction publications. I've written extensively for internet marketers, producing both copy and ebook products. So if you count the ebooks, and these don't truly have ISBN numbers, so I don't know, there are people who wouldn't consider those real books, but they're still publications that people have paid money for. If you add them all up, I have probably produced, conservatively speaking, at least 100 properties that make people money, and maybe twice that number of publications that were produced for people who paid me to make them. Sometimes I ghostwrite or rewrite other fiction. I had a client who had me help him rewrite a very autobiographical story that he wrote. It was a novel that was really quite beautiful, a sort of a rumination on his relationship with his father. There are very few genres I haven't touched. I do technical documentation as well and have for many years. That was my father's business. My father started his technical writing business in the 1980s. And that's how I learned that people will pay you to write things for them, which was a new idea for me. And then I tried very hard to run away from the family business and then ended up getting pulled back in. And that sort of put me on the course that I ended up on. And ironically, it was my father's collection of Executioner novels. He had dozens and dozens of them. I used to read those as a teenager. Little did I know that I was doing research for the job I would later have writing entries in that series. So there's a lot of wish fulfillment that comes with this type of job. You get to fulfill a lot of lifelong dreams if your dreams center around having all these adventures from a series of guests.
So, it's over 100, possibly 200. Would you say you're an overachiever?
No, because I would define that as about the time I have that J.K. Rowling bathtub full of money to lie down in at night. That would probably be overachievement. And of course, I joke because J.K. Rowling made so much money that she gave a lot of it. She gave so much money to charity that she ended up lowering her position in the rich people's standings. And every author should have such problems. But
Yeah.
no, until I reach that level of success, I will consider it merely adequate levels of achievement. I have been fortunate in that I make a living off the sweat of my brain. Like that's how I sit down at a computer and I write money. And I don't mean to put a sort of a crass commercial spin on it. I value what I do and I feel very strongly about it, and I like to turn out good work. But not everyone has the opportunity to sit down at a computer with no other inputs other than what they can research and actually make a living. So it's very gratifying, and I feel very fortunate.
Well, the one thing that I think is fascinating, and that is there are so many people that struggle with the concept of writing a book. I would say probably that even though public speaking is one of those things which is quoted as being the things which people most fear, I think that people would prefer to do public speaking than they would write a book. And you make a living from writing books on behalf of people. So why is it that you can succeed or excel in something which so many people struggle with?
I think in a lot of cases it has to do with simply how your brain is wired. I am terrible with technical things. I have a business colleague who does all of the technical support aspects of what we do together, where I'm writing web copy and emails, and he's taking care of the technical side of the business. Whenever I have to venture into that technical aspect, actually figure out why is this software not behaving as it is supposed to, I find it really frustrating. And his brain is wired in a way that he sees that as a delightful puzzle to solve. In that same way, if he has to write something, he finds it agonizing. Whereas I could fall down a flight of stairs and accidentally write a few paragraphs along the way. I think some people are born with a facility for it, but it's not that you can't train it. You can learn to do it and learn to do it better. A friend of mine came to me the other day, and he was working on an obituary for a relative, and he'd been agonizing over it for 3 days. And I said, please never do that. Just come to me and I'll help. And in 15 minutes, we were done. And it comes down to how does your brain handle communication? What I do is largely a communication skill. So as you can imagine, I don't have a lot of difficulty talking to people or about things. Shutting me up is actually usually the issue. So when I deal with people who need something written or want something written or are trying to write something, it's usually just a case of assessing, okay, where are you? Where are you along that curve of what you find easy and what you find uncomfortable and what you find difficult? And everyone can be moved along that curve. Everyone can learn the skills that they need to learn. I was speaking with a business contact the other day who has at times been an employer and at other times a client. And she was explaining that she was having difficulty working on a plot. And that's something I do over and over and over, work out the plots for books. And specifically, there are a number of resources for people who write fiction, including the Save the Cat plot beats. That's a reference to the fact that in most movies, you'll see someone do something where essentially they're saving a cat from a tree. They are doing something kind that explains to the viewer or the reader that this is the good guy. This is the person you should sympathize with. You'll see the opposite of Save the Cat when the evil villain casually executes a henchman in an early scene. That's where you establish this is a bad person who kills people who work for him, that kind of a thing. So the Save the Cat plot beats, you don't need to interpret them literally, but she was having trouble with some of the literal interpretations of what the plot beats are explained to be. And so I explained to her, no, these are abstracts, these are feelings. They are literally beats in the plot that you might choose to follow, but you don't have to. There's a number of different ways to conceptualize novel plots, and these are things you learn from experience. You only get one first novel, and they're all terrible. I wrote 2 of them, and they were terrible. The second one was slightly less terrible than the first one, but almost nobody writes a good novel the first time out. And there are famous published authors who will admit to you that their first book, when it eventually got published because they achieved success with later books, had to be extensively rewritten. Matthew Riley I believe he's Australian, an action-adventure writer whose books I've enjoyed. And in the foreword to one of his books, he explained, this was my first book, and I self-published it, and it didn't do well, and it wasn't very good, so I've rewritten. And that's a very common experience for successful authors. It's almost like you have to get the venom out of you. You have to exercise the poison before you can go on to write well. And in my case, learning to write novels was literally just a function of practice. Um, the first time I wrote a novel, I had very little idea of what I was doing. Other than having read a lot, doing extensive reading, especially if you've been a reader all your life, can help because it gives you references. It explains to you how a book is structured, how the mechanics of writing it work, and usually have a vague idea of how plots work. You know what you like and you know what works. And many people will cynically tell you that the reason some of us know what we like is because Hollywood and writers turn out the same plot over and over again. You can break those down into those plot. A lot of them are very similar. Some of them are almost literally taken from the guidebook of those things. Some of them are more abstract. But there are always exceptions, and everybody is different. So writing anything is it's a dual process of identifying where are you at, which I realize is poor grammar, but where do you find yourself on the continuum of what you're comfortable with and what you're not, and also where do you want to go? And so when you can find someone who can just help you get there, suddenly everything becomes easier because you have someone guiding you and helping you to get there. My services include, like, if someone wants to write a book, they don't usually want me to write it for them. But I've had people who've come to me and say, I want this book to exist. I'm never going to write it. You do that. And so I do. And it's always fun when someone has told you, here's the characters I want, here's the plot that I want, here's elements that I want in it, and then you get to play with that. I find that remarkably fun, just being able to work within those guidelines. It's like a new puzzle every time. If I want to sit down and write my own book, there's nothing stopping me. I don't feel any kind of creative suppression because this client is paying me good money to write a book about a topic that I wouldn't have picked for myself. I always have the option to go do that. So it's a lot of fun. It's a playground, really. And then when we get into the nonfiction and where I employ my technical writing skill set, that can be extremely educational and entertaining at the same time. I've written and ghostwritten any number of nonfiction publications, to include really boring stuff like, industrial documentation. People will say, how can you spend hours writing a manual for a piece of industrial machinery? It's not the machine that matters, it's the puzzle. It's how do I impart the information that I need to impart. And I always harken back to the old episode of MASH television series where they're following written instructions to disable a bomb that has fallen in the courtyard. And he said, now cut the red wire, but first. And that but first is a great example of how informational design, imparting information to other people through technical writing, really matters, because order of operations is an overarching concept. You never want to but first somebody when you're giving them important and critical instructions.
It's a funny example. Just as a summary, would you say, if someone was to ask you what you do, would you say that you were a ghostwriter?
I don't consider myself a ghostwriter because I'm also, I always say I'm a writer. And there are certain asterisks appended to that because I touch so many different genres. I am published under my own name several times over, so I don't feel like I've been relegated to the status of ghostwriter. And because I don't only do fiction, it's a little more broad in terms of how I would choose to define myself. I do make a distinction between being an author and being a working writer. So I would classify myself as the latter, because a working writer is someone who's making a living off the things that they type, off the sweat of their brain. Anyone can become an author, especially now where the barriers to entry are so low. You can follow the instructions, write a book, and publish it on Amazon directly. You can even write a Kindle book only where you don't even have to spend any money. It's completely free to set up a Kindle book and allow Amazon to take a portion of the profits because it's a virtual product. There's no physical product. There's no startup costs. They have the infrastructure. So anyone can become an author if they wish to varying degrees of success. This started with self-publishing, and when publish-on-demand technology came out, and suddenly you could pay someone to set up a book for you, create the ISBN numbers, help you with the cover, and make a book exist. That's how I did my first self-published novel. It felt like being a real author, but the market was immediately glutted with people who would have been screened out of the publishing process simply because they lacked basic mechanical experience. They weren't at the level of a published author necessarily, but there was nothing to stop those books from coming out. Then all of the publishers adopted the publish-on-demand technology. I used to work with a company called Paladin Press, who published 2 of my books, and they adopted publish-on-demand technology, which meant no longer do I have to keep an inventory of books that then sell out and are out of print until I print them again. Now I get an order for book X, I print it once. It comes out of the machine and I'm done. So that helped stave off the eventual demise of companies like that. But many of them did go under because as the shift to virtual books happened and Kindle books and other formats started outselling paperbacks, all of the major publishing companies felt the squeeze. So anybody can become an author now, and it doesn't mean a whole lot. It arguably didn't necessarily mean a whole lot unless you achieved widespread success before, but there was a lot more cachet associated with being an author, and a lot of people are still very enamored with the idea of, I want to be a published author. And these are usually the people who will add to their signature lines in their emails, published author. And I'd be lying if I said I hadn't done that myself. The thing is that if you really want to make a living at writing, it is a lot less glamorous than, I'm a successful author and people look at me and we talk about writing, we write about writing. That's a thing that many beginning authors tend to do, is they'll start blogs and they'll write about writing. They spend more time writing about writing than they do actually making money to get paid, sometimes not at all. To be a working writer, to get paid for what you're doing, requires you to make some compromises and to stretch yourself and take on work that you wouldn't choose to do. I like to say that you're not a working writer until you want to go to bed, but you can't because this is due and has to be finished before you can sleep. And I can't tell you how many nights of my life have been spent doing just that. I have contributed millions, literally millions of words of chaff to the internet for internet marketers who wanted long, involved websites that really didn't say a whole lot, but were there to achieve a certain search engine optimization purpose. And when I think back to how many hours of my life were spent doing that, I could regret it, but I don't, because I made a living doing it. And if someday I ever write a book about my own experience becoming a working writer and establishing myself in that space, those long evenings sitting in a room alone typing are very much part of that experience. But there are also really positive experiences. I remember there was one time when I was up all night long finishing a novel. I had promised my co-writer that my portion would be done by, let's call it Friday evening. So in order to finish on time, I had to stay up all night, and I did. And then I drove to Canada because I was set to go on vacation in Niagara Falls. So completely sleep deprived, I arrive in Canada late in the evening. It was 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I was in the touristy area of Niagara Falls where all the things are happening. And because I was completely wired, having spent all that time writing a book, I couldn't go to bed. So I found an outdoor rooftop TGI Fridays bar, and I sat there alone because this place was deserted and watched the lights of Niagara Falls, sipping my drink and thinking about the fact that I had just accomplished what I thought was a really, really good book. And there was no one there to experience that with me, but it's a cherished memory because of the feeling of accomplishment. And that is what writing is, whether it's fiction or it's nonfiction, whether it's helping further your business ends or it's just something you wrote because you wanted it to exist. That feeling of, I have done this, is what motivates people to keep going.
Well, I kind of ruined that for myself a little bit because I was engaged in the story and you were setting the scene and everything. And then I realized you're telling a story like you would as a writer, right? And it was brilliant.
No, actually, that's just me explaining that there's no calculation behind that. That's just how I think about things. It can be something of an occupational hazard because, I'll be listening to the radio and find myself copy editing the copy that they're reading in their ads. I'm like, that you ended that sentence wrong. That's don't do that. No, that's the wrong word. And my friends tell me that I ruin movies because someone will say, well, why did they do this? I'll say, well, narratively, they had to accomplish getting the characters from A to B. And so we employ, shut up, Phil, you're ruining the movie. So I've heard that a lot.
It's unconscious behavior for you now, yeah?
It's just how my brain works.
So what have you got in terms of thoughts of marketing a book?
Marketing a book, like making people buy your book, I don't see that as the goal in most cases. I see the book as the means of marketing, which is why I try to help people with usually small businesses, but it can be a business of any size, understand what a book can do for them. A book doesn't have to be long, and it also doesn't have to be complex, but the smartest people in business understand what having a book can accomplish for them. For example, I have a client who is he's a contractor. He builds buildings and does home he wants to write a book. I'm making this topic up, but let's say he wants to write a book on the top 10 disasters that he's seen in home renovation and home construction. The sorts of nightmare things that people can't look away from, but that every homeowner fears will happen to them. I'll spend all this money and there'll be a structural flaw in my home. It'll become a money pit. There are entire movies about that. So his book not only entertains the reader with the benefit of his experience, having been working this job for so many years, but also establishes in the reader's mind, he's identifying these problems. That means he can see them. That means I can trust him. That means when I want work done, I go to him, because if he can see the problems, he's not going to make the problems. Another client I have is a realtor. He wrote a whole book on his system for flipping homes and what he does as a realtor. Most of the people who read that book are not going to immediately go out and start their own home flipping business. What they're going to do is think about starting their own home flipping business and then turn to him as the realtor because he has demonstrated his expertise in the subject matter. In that way, any book can be used as a calling card and as a marketing tool to establish a connection with the prospective audience. You know, for instance, this realtor leaves his book behind when he goes and visits properties, things like that. You can even use fiction in this way. I have worked with a client who we ghost wrote some fiction that was simply a topic that his internet marketing audience would find interesting. I have to be vague about this because it was ghost written and I can't take credit for it. And then in putting that book out, it doesn't sell a product. You don't buy the book and then it says, you should buy this thing here. It doesn't say that. What it does do for you is that it shows you that this man who is marketing this book understands me. He understands me as part of this community who have this shared topic interest. This could work for any topic. And as a result, I'm entertained by his book, but I also start to associate him with expertise in that field, in this community. He's one of us. There's connection, there's rapport, and any salesman will tell you, you don't sell your product, you sell yourself. The more genuine you are, the more you connect with people who might buy, the more likely they are to trust you and to do so. So in that way, a nonfiction book, even a brief nonfiction book, can be used as a marketing tool for almost any business. I have yet to be presented with a business where that isn't the case. I'm sure there must be, but I haven't yet found one where I couldn't find a way to figure out how to apply that concept so they could use the book to their advantage. And then there are those people who just want a book to exist, whether it's a nonfiction book about a topic that they're really passionate about. Yeah, I'm making this up, but let's say you have someone who's really into the supernatural and they want to publish a book about their ghost hunting, the various adventures they've had. They might just want that book to exist because they want to share what they've experienced with others. But they may not be a writer, so that's where I come in and I can help them make that happen. There's lots of different sticking points when it comes to producing a book. People don't realize nobody writes a book. Everybody writes a chapter in a book and then repeats the process. A book is impossible to write. It's a mountain. You cannot climb a mountain in a single step. If I tell you, climb this mountain immediately, you can't do it. You have to start and go slow and achieve small goals along the way, or else it will feel overwhelming. So when people say, I could never write a book, it's just so much. Well, yeah, it's a lot by the time you get done, but don't write a book. Just write me a chapter. Work on that, and then we'll repeat that process. Before you know it, you've got a book.
That's a great point. So you raised something which is, I think, interesting. I think most people, at least marketing-wise, have heard of the concept of, giving away something which is of value in exchange for example, contact details. But what I really liked what you said was actually creating something fictional, a story, which, I mean, is entertaining to the person reading it. It's a book in the way that a fiction story would be, but it is relevant to that particular scenario. So you use the refurbishment, home refurb or home flipping example. You could do a story about someone who did that and it went wrong, or they learned from various different, and you said that there's movies about it. So I quite like that. I've not heard that before.
There have even been attempts to write instructional material in the form of a novel. I was first acquainted with this concept when I was in college, getting an accounting degree, which taught me that I didn't want an accounting degree. There is a famous novel called Accosting the Golden Spire by someone's pseudonym. The pseudonym for that person is Iris Wilde Collette, which is a a play on words for the IRS will collect. Accosting the Golden Spire is, I kid you not, an attempt to teach basic accounting principles while telling a fictional adventure story. It's not a good book. It has never been a good book. But when I read that book as an accounting student in college, it acquainted me with this new and novel idea of trying to impart actual knowledge while telling a fictional story. There are other authors who've done this much better. I've been really honored to work with the estate of Jerry and Sharon Ahern. Sharon is alive and well, but unfortunately, Jerry, her husband, passed away. The two of them wrote together many, many adventure novels, and they are fantastic novels. They were some of the novels that I read that put me on the path to want to write adventure stories. And one of the things that Jerry Ahern was really adept at was he was an expert on firearms, and he wrote for firearms trade publications, magazines of that nature. And so his novels weaved in his knowledge of how these things worked, things you should do, things you shouldn't do, ways to maintain them, things like that, such that after reading those novels, you came away with a real education in the field of firearms. It was sort of incidental. It was really more simply because he was very interested in the topic and it came out in his writing. But he was very specific. He did not make technical mistakes. One thing about the adventure audience is they really love what they love. So if you make a mistake involving a weapon, firearm, a knife, something like that, something that is of interest to them, they will notice that mistake. You know, if you create a gun in a caliber that has never existed, they'll notice that. These are people with encyclopedic knowledge of that field. So reading those novels showed me years after my experience with accounting fiction that it was possible to do that well and to impart knowledge in a way that was still entertaining. I've actually written some novels and some novellas along these lines since, using that inspiration of using, okay, I want to impart information that educates the reader on this topic, but I don't want to hit them over the head with it in the way that Accosting the Golden Spire does. Because, you know, very, very seldom do people break into conversation about, you know, the FASB standards for accounting principles, and it showed in that book. I'm sure I don't know if there's anyone listening to this who has ever heard of Accosting the Golden Spire, but I will never forget it.
Well, would you say that you prefer fiction over nonfiction?
Well, they're different. Fiction there's usually less research involved. It's less factually limiting, because obviously when you're writing nonfiction, you're limited to reality. There's research involved. There's technical things involved, depending on what you're writing. So if I'm writing a book about how to assemble a particular piece of machinery, I have to get it right. If I'm writing fiction, I only have to be entertaining. Yes, you obviously wouldn't fill it with factual errors, but fiction is much more freewheeling. The difference, though, is you could look at it the other way. When I'm writing nonfiction, I can look to reality. If I want to tell you how to put this machine together, all I need to know is how. If I want to tell an entertaining story, there's a lot more burden on it to be imaginative and entertaining and engaging. So there are people who are brilliant nonfiction and technical authors, technical writers, people who write, even editorial political commentary. Picture most political commentators. You probably wouldn't read a novel that they wrote, although a few of them have done novels. I've never read any of them. I know, like Bill O'Reilly, I think, has written some. There might be historical novels, and there's another fellow who's, I can't remember, who's done. I think Newt Gingrich, of all people, the politician, did some historical fiction novels. I've never read any of that, but they might be good. It's hard to say. I think most of the time you're engaging very different parts of the brain when you're working with fiction. And again, you're relying on your imagination. And when people review the work, it can be very different too. So the very first time I got a negative review on one of my fiction books, it hit a lot harder than people reviewing a nonfiction book. You can tell yourself, if they didn't like the nonfiction book, they don't like my opinion, they don't like my approach. If they don't like your fiction, it's like they don't like you. It feels much more personal. And another author of my acquaintance once said, Phil, those reviews are worth exactly what you paid for them, which was a good way to help keep it in perspective, because lots of people have it. I had one guy complain that I wrote a novel and I used passive voice too much. I'm like, well, if this were a technical manual, I could see the complaint. This was meant to be entertaining. But for some reason, that comment's always kind of rattled around in my brain. I was like, am I using too much passive voice when I'm writing fiction? So yeah, they're just different. One's not better than the other. I don't prefer one to the other. If you ask me what I would like to do, if I could just be independently wealthy, how would I like to spend my time? Then yeah, I'd probably like to, spend my mornings writing fiction and spend my afternoons doing nothing, which is what some of the world's most famous writers did. I think Hemingway spent his mornings writing until he was too drunk to write. Just spent the rest of the day fishing or something.
It is interesting how the negative reviews stick in your mind for a while. But in terms of the breakdown of what your activities are, what's the percentage in terms of fiction and nonfiction in terms of your daily activities?
Well, on an average day, it's about half and half, but there are very few average days. It really depends on the cycle of what I'm doing as far as what project is currently most urgent. So, for instance, if I have a novel that needs to be finished, I might devote almost 100% of my time to that, and I become utterly intolerable to be around when I'm finishing a novel because that's all that matters to me. And it's just leave me alone. I got to finish this, and that's all that I focus on. When on any given, if you averaged out the days, on any given day, I'm switching from project to project. I'll write a couple of chapters of fiction. I have this project that needs to be written, this piece of web copy that has to be done. It lends itself to very different days, so they don't get boring.
And what's your thoughts on writer's block, quote unquote?
I have experienced it. I pride myself on being very quick and being able to produce a lot in a very short amount of time. And I had a period of time where I was not able to produce anything. I was staring at the screen and couldn't get the words onto the page. And afterwards, I'm like, what's wrong with me? I produced, normally I'd be done with several chapters by now. And it turned out to be overwork. So in a lot of cases, writer's block is a function of you're working too much. You actually need to work less to work more. You need to give your brain time to recover in order to be more productive. The average writer who's experiencing writer's block is usually just having trouble getting started. Sometimes someone will get started and not know where to take it. I have a few tricks for if you're having trouble getting started. One of those is just start describing to me what you see. Describe the scene, describe where we are, describe the people, describe anything. It'll get things rolling. If what you're having trouble with is continuing, then usually the problem is I didn't plot out where I want to go. I don't have a solid foundation on which to build from. So for fiction and for nonfiction, the outline is always critically important. Did I outline what I want to do? Did I plot out the roller coaster curve of my plot, which is usually build, roll quickly down to a climax, and then level off? That's what I see as the roller coaster plot shorthand. That applies to almost everything that is fiction anyway. So did you have a foundation to work from? Because if you did, then you don't get stuck because you know where you want to go. You might have trouble with a transition chapter or how to get there, but that's a very different problem than I just don't know where to go. And most of the time when people are having trouble with writer's block, they are having trouble knowing how to break free of the problem they've created, which is usually not building a foundation or not knowing how to get started. Sometimes it's not knowing how to finish. Finishing is usually the easiest part because usually by the time you've written all that story, you've come to know your characters, so they kind of help you write the book itself. I've read other authors talk about, well, I tried to get my characters to recite all this dialogue, but they just wouldn't. And you say, well, aren't you in charge? But when you know the characters, like I wrote 23 executioner novels. The lead character of that book, the protagonist, Mac Bolan, I know what he would do in any situation because I know the character after so much familiarity with it. So really, you're just creating scenarios and dropping that well-developed character into them. And then how he reacts is very obvious how he would respond to a situation like that. And usually when people criticize, especially a long-running property for deviating from that, it's because the author wasn't familiar with the character. That's also why people have characters that behave inconsistently. That was a huge criticism of the Game of Thrones finale on HBO, was all of a sudden characters were hurrying to act in ways that simply were not logically supported because they tried to rush the ending. And they didn't have the benefit of George R.R. Martin's extensive build-up to that point because they had outrun the novels. They no longer had written source material to adapt. They were now, running free with a few plot points from George R.R. Martin to tell them where to go. So they rushed it, and it didn't make any sense. The same endings could have made more sense if they'd had several more seasons to develop them. They just didn't. So building your foundation and being consistent to your characters really makes a difference.
Good answer. So what's your favorite book that you created, and what's it about?
My favorite book that I created is called Monsters. It's a science fiction novel under my name. And it's about a future dystopian world where a man and his daughter are being hunted by authorities. And it's really, the book means so much to me because it's really a rumination on a father's love for his daughter. When I finished writing that book, I was terrified that I would never again find a topic that I found as interesting as that. It took me a little while. And I would hope every author could have that experience when writing a piece of fiction. I love this so much, I don't know if I'll ever like something much again. And you hope that each project will do that again. If you're not growing as a writer, then what are you doing? You have to be able to. I have a coaching student, a relatively young lady, who writes better than many adults of my acquaintance, and she told me, "Oh, I'm looking at some of my early stuff and I don't like it." I said, "That's wonderful, because if you grow enough as a writer to be able to look at stuff from a few months ago and hate it, that's a wonderful sign that you're improving." So we should always look back on our older work and not like it, up to a point.
Phil, what are your goals?
Well, my goal is to make the self-publishing report and the ghostwriting report, which are my coaching businesses, available to everyone. We have a Facebook group called the Self-Publishing Report, where I'll be releasing a 4-week writers fast class that covers some of the biggest problems that writers have for both fiction and nonfiction, and how to get past them. And they're literally just me talking on video and explaining how you can overcome some of these common problems, dealing with things like plotting and building the foundation, or outlining for talking about nonfiction, stuff like that. So my goal is to help other people achieve what I've been able to do and what I've been privileged to be able to do with a lot less stress. And it's kind of like saving a drowning man. If you could save the drowning man, why wouldn't you? Well, there's so many people out there who could produce books that make them happy, if only they had some help to get over the things that are stopping them from getting it. And I have the ability to help them. And it's not hard, because that's how my brain works. And if I can help them, well, of course I want to. So my goal is to help other people with that information so that they can achieve their own goals, create written works that further their business goals, that make them money. Because if you're interested in writing, or if you just have a business and you're hoping that you can find something that will help your business grow, these are all aspects where writing a book can help. And fortunately, it isn't hard if you just have the right help. And so many people have been, I wouldn't say raised to believe, because it's not like we preach this in society, but a lot of people think a book is this insurmountable obstacle, and it's not. It doesn't have to be. It never has to be, as long as you have the right help.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are many people that think, it's just such a really difficult thing to write a book, and I guess there are many failures as well. So perhaps it's strategy.
When your first book is always terrible, it discourages a lot of people. No one's ever told them, no, it's going to be bad. Just write another one. You have to get the first one, and you can't skip it. You can't say, I'll just skip the bad first novel and go right to a good one. It doesn't work. So if you're writing a book and you're like, I don't think it's very good, it shouldn't be. It won't be. Just write it.
Well, I think you've given some great insight here. So thank you very much for all the value. Can you tell people where the best place to find you is?
Well, my personal website, philelmore.com, will have announcements as far as whatever the most recent developments are for my coaching business. And our group on Facebook, the Self-Publishing Report, is available now. That's where we will be releasing the fast class. So, if you join that group, there'll be further developments there and announcements. And I post stuff there about writing from time to time, just whenever I feel like it. So those are both good ways. But philelmore.com is probably the easiest way, because anytime I'm doing something, I put an announcement there so people know.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today, Phil.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.